Dustin Honkin was the most evil person I've ever met in my life. The security for this trial exceeded my wildest imagination. The U.S. Marshals and the federal prosecutors viewed Dustin Honkin as the most dangerous defendant literally in their lifetimes because the stakes are the ultimate stakes that you could ever have, life or death.
His skull was in so many pieces they couldn't recover the whole thing. So they had smashed his head so much that they couldn't even find all the pieces. I don't understand what the purpose of that was. That's anger. A million questions went through my brain. I wanted to know what she had done to him, if it was her that did it to him, or she had hired somebody to do it, how she did it, what his last words were.
She was no longer the beautiful person. I saw evil for the first time. How could I have loved this person who was capable of doing this? And I told her to get the out of my house. I never wanted to see her again. And she said, wait a minute. If he finds out that I told you anything about this, he's gonna kill your kids. And then he's gonna kill you.
This is a picture of all 5 victims that were murdered. That was, I believe, the picture of that, I believe, was my aunt, my great aunt Millie, her wedding. I don't understand how anybody could do that. What bothers me the most is that my kids don't get to know him. He would have loved them so much. My childhood prior to my parents' divorce was the average, or what I would consider the average childhood. I was daddy's girl and he was my hero. I went everywhere with him. It was devastating when my parents got divorced, really. I wanted to be with both of them, but they co-parented very well together after that, and it made it a lot easier and acceptable for me. My parents got divorced when I was 5 because my dad was having an affair with Angela Johnson. And as soon as Dad and Mom got divorced, that's when it was like the tables turned and she became evil. She was like my evil stepmother, kind of, I guess you could say. She was not mean to me, usually, when my father was around. But if he did have to work during the day, then I would have to stay with her. When she'd wash my hair, she'd make my scalp bleed from her long fingernails. She would put me in the Wicked Witch costume and her daughter in the pink Pretty Princess dress and things like that. I would refuse to let her brush my hair all the way out because I didn't like to sit still that long. My hair would be kind of snarly in a half ponytail or whatever. And Angie would tell me that my hair was like that because my mom didn't love me. An evil soul says things like that to children. As an adult, I feel like she did those kinds of things because she didn't ever get to experience real love, maybe. Because looking at her, I feel like she's empty, like her soul has left her body or something.
Angie Johnson was my best friend. I was in my late 20s and had just never had a best friend like her before. She was beautiful. She was very animated, very extroverted. We had a lot of fun together. We were just goofy. And I was closer to her than my own sisters. Angie was first involved with Terry DeGoose. I saw firsthand about their relationship. It was volatile. Terry was, he was obsessed with her and did not want her even looking at another man, let alone Dustin, because Terry was involved with Dustin through drugs. Terry, I believe, was one of his drug runners. I did not know Dustin's involvement in the drugs. I had no idea that the operation was as big as it was. I thought maybe he was small town druggy. But I told her when she wanted to know my opinion, I said, Dustin makes me uneasy, on edge, and he had black eyes like a shark. She was disappointed because she said she was in love with him, and she said this was the man she was going to spend her life with. And I just thought that was the biggest mistake. In Terry's mind, they were not breaking up. But when she became involved with Dustin, she ended up getting pregnant, and she said he'll kill me if he finds out that I'm pregnant, especially with Dustin's baby. So I said, well, how would you make him go away? And she said, $20,000 and a trip to Mexico. That's what it would take. And I said, oh, okay. So I believed that Terry was going to go to Mexico. I was so naive.
Dustin Honken. Well, I think of him in this photo as a nerd because he's kind of nerdy looking, but I know so much more about him than when the photo was taken. I see somebody who looks like a nerd, but who is pure evil, had brutally murdered 5 people. Dustin Honken was a very bright individual. He knew he could make more money if he manufactured the methamphetamine rather than just sell it. So he went to a local community college and took a lot of chemistry classes. And he decided that he'd do enough. So he started manufacturing methamphetamine to be sold by several people that they recruited to distribute the methamphetamine. These people had disappeared literally off the face of the earth. I don't recall another case in my 47 years as an Iowa lawyer or judge where that happened. Any reasonable person would assume that they had been kidnapped and murdered, but they had no idea where they were buried. I had a sense that Dustin Honken was a dangerous man because I thought it was likely, it was the most reasonable explanation that these 5 people who disappeared off the face of the earth, that Dustin Honken had something to do with it. The authorities believed that he was responsible for the murders. And I said, if you thought that Dustin Honken murdered them, you need to charge him and prove it and convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, and then I would sentence him accordingly. Most defendants that I've sentenced, over 4,000 defendants, they're not evil, they just do something stupid. Dustin Honken, in my view, was pure evil. Dustin Honken was the most evil person I've ever met in my life.
This is Dustin Honken. His eyes were very dark, like soul gone. My father did know Dustin Honken, but I had no clue that Dad was involved with drugs. He was very, very good at keeping me protected and not seeing any of that. I seen him just like any other little girl sees their dad. It was a normal weekend. We went to Grandma's to eat supper. And then when we were done eating supper, I was told that he was going to be going somewhere, and I was able to stay awake and wait for him, and he'd be back by midnight. I honestly don't recall if he told me he was going to talk to Angie. I know my grandmother knew he was, but he probably just told me he had to take care of something. I stayed up all night that night, and I sat on the couch watching the clock turn to midnight. And I can remember staring out the window, looking for headlights all night. The sound of a clock ticking in the room is terrible to me. I don't like the sound of a clock ticking because that's all I could hear that night. Grandma told me to get some sleep, and I couldn't. The TV was off, there was just a lamp on, and I was still up when Grandpa got up to go to breakfast. And he told me, oh, he'll be here, don't worry about it. And took me to breakfast with him. And he wasn't home when we got back. I did go with Grandma to Dad's house, looking for any kind of evidence that would help to lead where he was. Looked just like we had left it when we went to Grandma's for supper that night. It was pretty overwhelming. I know that I was asked to think of anybody that seemed scary to me at the time, or anything I could have that would indicate to where he might be. Angie probably was one of the scariest people in my life at that point. And I do believe by this time that I was aware that Dad had left that night to go to Angie's. I had asked my mom if she would let me call Angie to see if she knew anything. So I called Angela Johnson, and she told me that my dad never showed up. He was supposed to, that he must have gotten distracted with some friends, decided to do something else. I didn't believe her. My instant gut feeling was that she was involved somehow.
These images are the ones I've seen in the media, newspaper, TV. It's of Lori Duncan and her daughters, Candace and Amber, Greg Nicholson and Terry DeGoose. It just brings up all those memories, all those years that they were missing, and it's just very hard. I kept being questioned over the years by law enforcement because people were missing and they were just trying to get to the bottom of where they were. They thought I would know because all law enforcement knew that Angie and I had been friends and that we had been very close. And she's Dustin's girlfriend. I had two very formal-looking agents show up to my job. They came in suits and sunglasses to a nursing home and then wanted to question me in the lobby. And I was shocked. I said, I can't tell you anything. I just lied right through my teeth. Just lied. I lied to everyone. My husband didn't know. Nobody knew. And she called me up and asked if she could come over. And I knew she hadn't been herself for a few weeks. She was on edge and she was telling me she was having nightmares. And I thought, well, come on over, we'll drink some wine, have a girls' day. I thought maybe her and Dustin got into a fight. So I got the wine and she said, I have something to tell you that it may change your opinion of me. I have to get this out. I can't keep this to myself anymore. And I just couldn't imagine, could not imagine what was going to come out of her mouth.
I got bullied. There was a specific person that would always say stuff on the school bus. She'd say, was that Ashley's missing dad dead in the ditch? And everybody would laugh. My worst fears, it was getting cold outside at night and that he was lost somewhere or got in an accident and nobody could see where he was at. I would have nightmares. I'd wake up crying, concerned for him. I can remember in the first few months for sure, just staring so hard at people going by in cars or walking or anywhere, hoping to see his face. Every time the phone would ring, you'd just pray it was him.
She liked to have her hair brushed. She liked someone else to brush it for her. And I sat on the couch and she sat on the floor between my legs and I was brushing her hair. And she said, well, you know, we were looking for Greg. And, you know, that night that we used your car, and they had used it several times before that because they were looking for Greg. Greg and Terry were in the same boat as far as their involvement with the police, and Dustin felt they would end up putting him in prison, and he didn't want to go to prison, and she needed to talk to him. But she said, we found him, but he wasn't alone. She said, well, I knocked on the door and Lori, his girlfriend, came to the door and Angie said, I'm supposed to be at this party and I think I have the wrong address because when I went to the house, the party wasn't there. Do you mind if I look at your phone book? And she said that Lori said, sure, come on in. And when Angie walked in, Dustin followed her. And Dustin had the gun looking for Greg. Lori had asked her, "Why are you here in my house? Who are you?" And Angie told her, "You got involved with the wrong man." And she said she had 2 little girls, and I took them upstairs and I had them put stuff in their backpacks, like they were going to go away somewhere fun. And she said we just loaded everybody up in the car. At that point, I had stopped brushing her hair and I was just sitting there thinking, I think something bad happened here because I knew those people were missing. Came and got the girls and shot them as well. She was no longer the beautiful person. I saw evil for the first time. To me, she was as guilty as he was. It was like she might as well have just pulled the trigger herself. She was just as bad as he was. At that point, I said, it's the worst thing I'd ever heard in my life. At that point, what I was first feeling was shock. And then how could I have been friends? How could I have loved this person who was capable of doing this? And I told her to get the out of my house. I never wanted to see her again. And she said, "Wait a minute. Dustin can't ever know that I told you this. If he finds out that I told you anything about this, he's gonna kill your kids. And then he's gonna kill you." I knew I couldn't tell anyone because I knew he had already killed 2 children. There was nothing special about mine. They would have been nothing to him. And it would just be another witness eliminated. I was nothing to him. My girls were nothing to him. I was nervous a lot in those years. Whenever my husband wouldn't be in the house and I was alone with the kids, I thought anything can happen. It was a very trying time. I was just always looking over my shoulder, not trusting people. And I was starting to have a real struggle with sleeping and nightmares. And I thought, after all this time, why is this affecting me so much? I mean, my mental state. And then I had a dream, a very vivid dream one night of my dad, and he was, he was, he was holding the hands of Candace and Amber, and I could see them very clearly. And like in slow motion, he turned with them and they were walking away from me. And I remember waking up, and it's just like a light went off, and I said, I have to say something. I have to let somebody know their families are not looking for missing people. They're looking for their dead relatives. That dream was the turning point for me. And I just knew I just had to say something. I had a wave of emotions that day. I felt a lot of relief, but at the same time, it was heartbreaking because there was no happy ending. But it was such a weight lifted off of me when I could finally say those words that she said to me. That day was different than any other day that I've been questioned. I was very nervous, scared, because there was still that threat over my head. When I sat down, I remember him sliding a box of Kleenex to me and said, he said, "Today is the day you're going to set yourself free." And that day I told all about her confession, and it was a relief, but at the same time, I was afraid of what was to come. What would be the aftermath of this?
When Angela Johnson was arrested, something very interesting happened. She was put in the only county jail in Iowa that allowed men and women to be in the same cell block, but not in the same cell. And they put her in a cell that was next to a government informant. And so the informant came up with a ruse, claiming that he had a buddy who was serving a life sentence who actually wanted to die, and he would take the rap for these murders. And if Angela Johnson would draw a map of where the bodies were located, this informant would get that information to his buddy, and he worked on her and worked on her and worked on her, and finally she drew the map.
4 bodies were found just outside Mason City. A short time later, a 5th was discovered at another rural location, Lori Duncan and her 2 daughters, as well as Greg Nicholson. Dustin Honkin had killed the 4, along with another man, Terry DeGoose.
And it was a multi-day process to unearth those bones. The government had FBI agents that were trained to unearth burial sites who very carefully took out each of the bones and then reconstructed them, including the skulls of all four individuals from the one site because they were shot in the head. And you could see not only the bullet hole, but the shattered skulls. With regard to Mr. DeGoose, there was testimony that Dustin Honken beat Mr. DeGoose severely with a baseball bat, and you could see all the broken parts of his skull after they unearthed it. And the two little girls, a 6 and 10-year-old, they had just come into the house when they were kidnapped from swimming at a neighbor's pool. So they were still wearing the same swimsuits 7 years later when their bodies were discovered.
I was in class when Mrs. B came out of the office and told me that I had a phone call. It was my mom, and she told me that they had found Dad. And it was like a relief in a way for a second, but then it's like the world got quiet. A million questions went through my brain. I wanted to know what she had done to him, if it was her that did it to him, or she had hired somebody to do it, how she did it, what his last words were. I mean, he had multiple gunshots to him all over his body. His skull was in so many pieces they couldn't recover the whole thing. So they had smashed his head so much that they couldn't even find all the pieces. I don't understand what the purpose of that was. That's anger. It really shut me off inside, I think. I became very cold, and because I was broken. I didn't want to feel reality.
The government had serious concerns that Dustin Honken would attempt to engineer an escape plot from the courthouse. He had a lot of contacts on the outside. He was a member of the Aryan Brotherhood. They were worried that he would recruit Aryan Brotherhood members who were on the outside to assist in that escape plot, and that Dustin Honken would take any measure necessary, including killing anybody he needed to effectuate the escape plot. If Dustin Honken had ever escaped, they had grave concerns that he would retaliate against all of the witnesses who testified against him. For the first couple weeks of the trial, I just hid in my home office, and neither I, my wife, or my daughter could go anywhere without U.S. Marshals taking us. The security for this trial exceeded my wildest imagination. The U.S. Marshals and the federal prosecutors viewed Dustin Honken as the most dangerous defendant literally in their lifetimes, because the stakes are the ultimate stakes that you could ever have, life or death.
It was important for me to be there every day, to be my dad's voice, to represent my dad, to show that he had people that loved him. I was stoked to go look her in the face that first time. And as soon as I got to the door to walk into the courtroom, I stopped, I froze, and realized I was about to face my dad's murder. But eventually I went in with my mom. When we walked in the courtroom, finally, she turned around and waved at me, like happy and excited to see me. And I didn't know exactly how to interpret that. She's trying to prove her innocence or make me believe or be on her side, maybe. I'm not sure. I think it would have never happened if Angela wasn't involved. I feel like she was the initiator. However, I think that she probably got some kind of excitement from the situation or satisfaction.
I feel that Dustin Honkin was so evil because of the cold-blooded way he was willing to kidnap Greg Nicholson, his new girlfriend, and the two little girls, and execute them, really assassinate them, execution style, by shooting them in the back of the head. And he never showed any remorse. And even the day he was executed and he had a chance to give his last words, he showed absolutely no remorse. So that's why I think he was pure evil. Angela Johnson, I think, was under kind of the spell of Dustin Honkin. Certainly what she did and her involvement in it was evil. Whether she's evil to the core, I don't know. I kind of think maybe not. In her last round of appeals, I ordered a new trial just on the penalty phase, and then I sentenced Angela Johnson to life.
I don't understand his thinking in that phase, because there was two little girls whose lives were taken at not only Dustin's hands, but Angie was the means to get to them. And how could the judge not take that into account? That she's just as evil as Dustin was. This was a human being. This was a person. It's very hard to look at this. It's hard to imagine, I'm sure, for most people, why this would still be hard for me to talk about. And it's just still a hard thing for me to live with. And I just want people to know that was not an easy 7 years for me. It was not easy by a long shot. But I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't change the outcome, but I wish I could have given them some closure sooner. But I can't ever change that fact. But I'd like Terry's family to know that I'm sorry.
Even though he took my dad's life from me, as soon as they announced his passing, I just stood there and I said, now what do they do with his body? And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, like his mom, what if she wants to bury him somewhere? And they said, well, she'll have to pay the state or the US for his body. And that bothered me a lot because I don't find that fair to her. So when I got home, the ladies she's in church groups with, I said that if she needed help with assistance to pay for it, that I would help them. Because I know I just wanted Dad to be home. And she didn't ask for all that to happen. I've been taught that we should always forgive. I forgive Dustin. I've forgiven him. However, I have not forgiven Angela. Learning that Angie's death sentence had been overturned to life in prison was like a kick in the stomach. I thought, imagine that she got away again. My daddy is still my hero. He always will be. I understand now, and there's some things that he made bad judgments on. I understand that, but we all make mistakes. And like I said, you deserve second chances. But he never got his second chance. I can feel my dad with me. Sometimes it feels like he's not there, but there's been times when I really, really need reassurance that something happens. A song will come on the radio. My big, tough dad loved silly songs like Michael Bolton or Tanya Tucker, stuff like that. And those aren't songs they really play on the radio anymore. So when they come on, I really feel like it's for a reason. It's just a reassurance and a reminder that he is still alive. He is still with me. I just can't see him.
The road cut through the Minnesota countryside like a dark scar across frozen earth. On most nights, nothing happened there. No traffic, no noise, no witnesses. Just endless fields stretching beneath a sky so black it seemed to swallow sound itself. But on one October night in the year 2000, something happened. Something that would haunt an entire community for decades. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a scream. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't even a phone call. It was silence. The kind of silence that arrives unexpectedly. The kind that settles over a family dinner table when someone doesn't come home. The kind that grows heavier with every passing minute. At 10:14 p.m., a porch light burned outside a small white house on the edge of town. Inside, a mother glanced toward the window for what felt like the 100th time. Her daughter should have been home. She had left work hours earlier. The drive was less than 15 minutes. There were only 2 roads leading back into town, and yet her car never appeared. By midnight, concern became fear. By dawn, fear became panic. By the end of the week, the town would become the center of one of Minnesota's most baffling criminal investigations. And nobody knew it yet. The victim was 23 years old, known by nearly everyone. Friendly, reliable, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, volunteered for local events, and waved to strangers from her pickup truck. People described her using the same words over and over. Responsible, careful, predictable. She wasn't the type to disappear. She wasn't the type to leave without telling anyone. And she certainly wasn't the type to vanish without a trace. When officers arrived at her workplace the next morning, they found nothing unusual. Co-workers reported seeing her leave on schedule. Security cameras were limited. The footage available showed her walking through the parking lot shortly after sunset. Then she was gone. Investigators retraced her route home. Every intersection, every gas station, every side road, every possible turn. Nothing. No accident. No abandoned vehicle. No evidence of a breakdown. No sign of a struggle. It was as though the darkness itself had swallowed her whole. The disappearance hit the community like a thunderclap. This was the kind of town where people left doors unlocked. The kind of town where neighbors knew each other's names. The kind of town where children rode bicycles until sunset without fear. Now, people locked their windows. Parents kept children indoors. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed she had run away. Others suspected a secret relationship. A few whispered darker possibilities. A predator. A stalker. Someone hiding in plain sight. The sheriff's office launched an extensive search. Volunteers flooded nearby fields. Helicopters scanned wooded areas. Dogs followed scent trails through ditches and farmland. For a brief moment, hope remained alive. Then came the discovery. A hunter walking through a remote area several miles from town noticed something unusual near a cluster of trees. At first, it looked like discarded clothing. Then he stepped closer. The call to authorities came minutes later. Investigators arrived in force. Crime scene tape stretched across the landscape. Photographers documented every inch of ground. Evidence markers appeared one after another. And as the sun sank below the horizon, a devastating reality emerged. The missing woman had not vanished voluntarily. She had become the victim of a violent crime. News spread through town almost instantly. Shock turned into grief. Grief turned into anger. Residents demanded answers. Who had done this? Why? How could something so horrific happen here? Detectives worked around the clock. Interviews piled up. Witness statements filled boxes. Thousands of leads poured in. Some credible, most useless. Every theory seemed possible. Every suspect seemed suspicious. Yet nothing held together. There were fragments of evidence at the scene. Small details. Tiny clues. The sort of clues investigators hoped would point directly toward a killer. But forensic technology in 2000 was not what it would later become. Evidence that seemed promising quickly reached dead ends. Fingerprints failed to identify a suspect. Fibers revealed little. Witness descriptions conflicted. The case began slipping through investigators' fingers. Weeks became months. Months became years. The murder remained unsolved. And slowly, painfully, the case entered a category every detective fears. Cold case. The phrase carries a strange weight. It doesn't simply mean a case is old. It means momentum has died. Witnesses move away. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Hope shrinks. For the victim's family, every holiday became a reminder. Every birthday carried an empty chair. Every passing year deepened the wound. The community tried to move forward. Businesses opened. Children grew up. New families moved into town. But the case never truly disappeared. People still talked about it. Quietly. Carefully. Sometimes over coffee. Sometimes at bars after midnight. Sometimes when a stranger's name surfaced in conversation. Everyone seemed to have a theory. No one had proof. Then something strange began happening. Years after the murder, investigators received anonymous tips. Not one. Not two. Dozens. The calls came at odd hours. Some claimed knowledge of the crime. Others named potential suspects. Many contradicted each other. Yet a pattern slowly emerged. One name appeared again and again. A local man. Not a drifter. Not a stranger. Someone familiar. Someone who had lived among them all along. Detectives examined him repeatedly. Each time they ran into the same problem. Insufficient evidence. Suspicion alone could not support an arrest. And so the years continued to pass. The case file grew larger. Shelves filled with documents. Boxes accumulated in storage rooms. Retired detectives handed materials to younger investigators. Generations of law enforcement inherited the mystery. The victim's photograph remained pinned to bulletin boards. A smiling face frozen in time. 23 forever. As the 2000s faded into the 2010s, advances in forensic science began transforming criminal investigations across America. Cases once considered impossible suddenly cracked open. Old evidence gained new value. DNA testing became more sophisticated. Databases expanded. Cold cases that had gathered dust for decades suddenly found new life. Investigators in Minnesota watched these developments closely. Some wondered whether the forgotten evidence from a murder might still hold answers. Others remained skeptical. The years had taken their toll. Evidence had been examined countless times. What could possibly be found now that had been missed before? Still, one detective refused to let the case die. He wasn't part of the original investigation. He hadn't stood at the crime scene in 2000. He hadn't conducted the first interviews. But he became obsessed with understanding every detail. Every report, every photograph, every witness statement, every unexplained inconsistency. Night after night, he reviewed materials that others had long abandoned. And gradually, something caught his attention. A tiny detail buried inside thousands of pages. A detail so small it had been overlooked for years. Yet once noticed, it became impossible to ignore. The detective followed the thread. One document led to another. One interview connected to another. One forgotten observation suddenly aligned with a piece of physical evidence. For the first time in years, the investigation moved forward. Quietly, carefully, without public attention. Detectives reopened old lines of inquiry. They re-interviewed witnesses. They tracked down people who had not spoken about the case in decades. Some remembered nothing. Others remembered more than expected. And with each conversation, the picture became slightly clearer. Not complete, not enough for charges, but clearer. Meanwhile, the community remained unaware. Most residents believed the case would never be solved. It had become part of local history, a tragedy without an ending, a mystery destined to remain unsolved. Then, behind closed doors, investigators made a decision that would change everything. They submitted critical evidence for a new round of forensic testing. Technology had evolved dramatically since 2000. Methods once impossible were now routine. Results that had taken months could be achieved in days. The evidence was transported under strict procedures. Experts examined material collected decades earlier. And then everyone waited. Days passed. Weeks passed. The anticipation grew. Detectives understood the stakes. A breakthrough could finally identify a killer. Failure could mean another decade of silence. No one knew which outcome was coming. Then the laboratory report arrived. A single document, several pages long, quiet, unremarkable in appearance, yet potentially explosive. Investigators gathered to review the findings. The room was silent. No phones, no small talk, no distractions, only the sound of pages turning. And then someone looked up. The expression on his face said everything. For more than 20 years, the case had resisted every effort. Thousands of hours, thousands of leads, countless dead ends. Now, suddenly, there was movement, real movement, the kind detectives dream about, the kind families pray for, the kind communities never expect to see after so many years. Outside, life continued as normal. People drove to work. Children attended school. Stores opened their doors. Nobody realized that one of Minnesota's most haunting cold cases was about to explode back into the headlines. Nobody realized investigators were closing in on a suspect. And nobody realized that when the arrest finally came, it would send shockwaves through the town unlike anything seen since the night the young woman disappeared into the darkness of October 2000. The news did not break with sirens. It did not begin with flashing lights or television cameras crowding the courthouse steps. It began with a knock on a door. A simple knock, the kind that happens every day across America. But this one arrived carrying 20 years of unanswered questions. Inside a modest home on the outskirts of town, a man opened the door and found investigators standing in front of him. Their faces were calm, professional, controlled, yet there was something unmistakable in their eyes. Purpose. For more than 2 decades, detectives had chased shadows. Now, they believed they were finally standing in front of the man responsible. The arrest itself was quiet. No dramatic chase. No violent confrontation. No attempt to run. Neighbors watched from windows as police vehicles lined the street. Some recognized the man immediately. Others stared in disbelief. Many had known him for years. Some had worked beside him. Others had shared drinks with him. A few had trusted him completely. That was the part nobody could understand. The suspect was not a mysterious outsider. He was not a stranger who drifted through town and vanished. He had remained, living among the very people who spent years wondering who the killer was. The image spread quickly. Local television stations interrupted programming. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Social media exploded with speculation. One question dominated every conversation. How? How could someone remain hidden in plain sight for so long? Detectives refused to reveal every detail immediately. They understood the danger. After 20 years, rumors had become almost as numerous as facts. The investigation had accumulated countless theories, false leads, and mistaken assumptions. They needed evidence. Not headlines, not speculation. Evidence. And according to investigators, The evidence now pointed in a direction they could no longer ignore. The breakthrough had emerged from material collected at the original crime scene. For years it sat inside evidence storage, cataloged, preserved, largely forgotten outside the cold case unit. Back in 2000, scientists lacked the tools needed to fully analyze what had been recovered. The technology simply wasn't there. But time changes everything. What once appeared insignificant could now become a roadmap. Tiny biological traces, fragments invisible to the naked eye, microscopic details capable of identifying a person with astonishing precision. When analysts re-examined the evidence, they discovered something investigators had hoped for but never expected. A genetic profile, partial at first, incomplete, yet strong enough to justify further work. The results ignited a chain reaction. Detectives reopened files that had not been touched in years. Old witness interviews suddenly gained new importance. Timelines were reconstructed. Movements were rechecked. Statements once dismissed returned to the spotlight. And as the pieces began aligning, a troubling picture emerged. The suspect's name appeared repeatedly, not always prominently, not enough to trigger alarm at the time, but enough to create a pattern. Patterns matter in homicide investigations. A single coincidence can be ignored. 2 coincidences raise eyebrows. 10 coincidences become impossible to dismiss. Investigators found inconsistencies stretching back to the earliest days of the case. Minor discrepancies, small contradictions, details that seemed harmless individually. Together, they painted something far darker. Witnesses remembered conversations, strange comments, unexpected reactions, moments that felt insignificant in 2000 but unsettling years later. One witness recalled how quickly the suspect became interested in details of the investigation. Another remembered unusual questions, questions nobody else was asking, questions that seemed oddly specific. At the time, nobody thought much of it. The entire town was obsessed with the murder. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone discussed theories. Everyone speculated. Yet hindsight has a way of changing perspective. Comments once considered normal suddenly appeared suspicious. Investigators dug deeper. They examined employment records, financial documents, vehicle ownership histories, phone records preserved through old archives. The deeper they looked, the more uncomfortable the picture became. Then came another discovery. A witness who had remained silent for years finally agreed to speak. Not because of pressure, not because of publicity, because of age. The witness feared dying before telling investigators what had been remembered all along. The meeting lasted hours. Detectives listened carefully. Every word mattered. The witness described an interaction from shortly after the murder. At the time, it seemed strange. Now it sounded chilling. The suspect allegedly made a statement that suggested knowledge of facts never released publicly. That detail electrified investigators. Certain information from crime scenes remains confidential. Only detectives know it. Only perpetrators know it. If the statement was accurate, it carried enormous significance. Still, detectives needed more. Memory can be unreliable. People misremember. Rumors evolve. Stories change over time. A case this important required certainty. So investigators returned to the forensic evidence. Again, and again, and again. Experts reviewed every available sample. Independent laboratories confirmed findings. Procedures were scrutinized. Chain of custody records were verified. Nothing could be left to chance. The closer investigators came to making an arrest, the higher the stakes became. A mistake could destroy everything. Defense attorneys would examine every detail, every report, every collection method, every laboratory result, every signature. Detectives understood this. They built their case carefully, brick by brick, piece by piece. Meanwhile, the suspect continued living his life, working, shopping, attending community events, interacting with neighbors, all while investigators quietly assembled evidence around him. The secrecy was intentional. Detectives feared that any leak could compromise the operation. If the suspect became aware of the investigation's progress, evidence might disappear. Witnesses might be influenced. The entire case could collapse. So they remained silent. For months. Then came a moment everything changed. A judge approved a critical warrant. The document authorized investigators to obtain a fresh DNA sample directly linked to the suspect. This was the test. The moment that would either validate years of work or send detectives back to square one. Officers executed the warrant discreetly. The sample was collected, submitted, processed. Everyone waited. The waiting felt endless. Some detectives had invested years of their careers into the case. Others had inherited it from retired investigators who never lived to see resolution. Entire generations of law enforcement personnel carried emotional connections to the file. Now the answer seemed within reach, or perhaps about to slip away forever. The laboratory's findings arrived weeks later. The atmosphere inside the office changed immediately. Nobody needed to read the entire report. The first pages told the story. The results were powerful, compelling, difficult to explain away. For investigators, it was the strongest development in the history of the case. The evidence alone did not answer every question. It did not reveal motive. It did not describe exactly what happened during the final moments of the victim's life. But it placed the suspect in a position he had spent decades denying. And that changed everything. The arrest warrant followed. Signed, approved, executed. 20 years after the murder. 20 years after a family's nightmare began. The suspect entered the criminal justice system as television cameras finally arrived. National media picked up the story. True crime programs rushed to cover it. Internet forums erupted with theories. Many celebrated. Others remained skeptical. Not everyone was convinced. Some residents struggled to accept the possibility that a familiar face could be responsible. They remembered kindness, friendly conversations, years of normal behavior. The idea felt impossible. Yet investigators repeatedly emphasized a difficult truth. Violent offenders rarely look like monsters. Most appear ordinary. That is precisely why they remain hidden. Court proceedings soon began, and with them came a flood of information never previously released to the public. Evidence, witness accounts, forensic details, investigative strategies. The community learned how much detectives had concealed over the years. Many were stunned. Some details triggered outrage. Others triggered fear. One revelation in particular shook residents. Investigators disclosed that the suspect may have crossed paths with the victim before the night of the murder. Not as a close acquaintance, not as a friend, but possibly through routine interactions, ordinary encounters, the kind people forget within hours. That possibility transformed the case. The attack no longer appeared completely random. It suggested observation, opportunity, perhaps even planning. Questions multiplied faster than answers. How long had the suspect known of the victim? What exactly happened on that October night? Why her? Why then? The suspect refused to provide explanations. Publicly, he maintained his innocence. Privately, investigators hoped pressure might eventually produce admissions. None came. The silence continued. Families of both the victim and suspect found themselves trapped inside a storm of attention. Reporters pursued interviews. Neighbors shared opinions. Speculation flooded every corner of town. For the victim's relatives, the experience felt surreal. For years they had begged for movement. For years they feared the case would remain unsolved forever. Now an arrest had finally arrived. Yet closure remained frustratingly distant. An arrest is not the same as an answer. It creates hope, not certainty. The emotional weight remained enormous. Every hearing reopened old wounds. Every news story revived painful memories. Every courtroom appearance forced the family to relive events they had spent decades trying to survive. And still the mystery persisted. Because even as investigators celebrated a breakthrough, critical questions remained unanswered. Questions that haunted everyone involved. Questions buried somewhere within the missing hours of that October night. Questions only one person might truly be capable of answering. The victim's final movements. The exact location where the encounter began. The sequence of events leading to violence. The reason the crime occurred at all. Those details remained locked away, perhaps permanently. As prosecutors prepared for trial, detectives continued searching for anything that could strengthen the case. Old witnesses were revisited, archived evidence re-examined, forgotten tips re-evaluated. Nothing was considered too small. Nothing was ignored, because after 20 years, investigators understood something better than anyone. Cold cases are rarely solved by a single breakthrough. They're solved by persistence. Thousands of tiny pieces finally aligning. Years of patience finally rewarded. Yet even as momentum built toward justice, a strange feeling lingered over the town. A feeling difficult to describe. Relief mixed with uncertainty. Hope mixed with grief. Because the arrest had not erased the past. It had not returned the victim. It had not healed decades of trauma. Instead, it forced everyone to confront a disturbing possibility. For more than 20 years, while residents attended football games, celebrated holidays, raised children, and rebuilt their lives, the answer may have been living among them all along. Hidden behind ordinary routines. Hidden behind familiar smiles. Hidden behind the illusion of normalcy. And as the case moved toward its next chapter, one reality became impossible to ignore. The biggest shock was no longer that the murder had happened. The biggest shock was that the mystery had survived for so long. The courtroom did not feel like a place built for truth. It felt like a pressure chamber. Every sound was magnified. Every breath carried weight. Every pause stretched too long. On the morning of the first major hearing, the hallway outside was already crowded before sunrise. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Cameras lined the walls. Microphones pointed like weapons waiting for impact. Inside, the suspect sat still, unmoving, expression controlled, eyes forward. A man now at the center of a story that had taken 20 years to reach this point. Across the room, the victim's family sat together. They had waited longer than most people could imagine waiting for anything. 2 decades of silence had brought them here. Not closure, not peace, but confrontation. The judge entered. The room rose. Then silence returned, heavier than before. Prosecutors began carefully. No dramatics, no emotional language. Just facts, dates, evidence, procedures. But behind every sentence was something more. A story the community already knew fragments of, now being reconstructed in full legal form. October 2000. A disappearance. A search. A discovery that changed everything. Then years of silence. And now, finally a name. The prosecution outlined the forensic breakthrough first. DNA evidence, once incomplete, now reanalyzed with modern technology. Matched against a sample obtained from the suspect under warrant. The courtroom shifted immediately. Even those pretending to remain neutral leaned slightly forward. This was the moment everything hinged on. Not emotion, not rumor, science. The prosecutor described the chain of custody in detail. How the original evidence had been preserved. How it had been sealed. How it had remained untouched for years except for documented review. Then how new testing methods revealed a profile that had never been fully extracted before. A profile that pointed in a single direction. The suspect's direction. Defense counsel reacted quickly. They were prepared. They questioned methodology. They questioned contamination. They questioned timing. Every possible weakness was examined under legal light. Because in cases this old, the margin between certainty and doubt is everything. One flaw could unravel decades of investigation. But the prosecution did not rely on a single pillar. They had built redundancy into the case. Witness testimony followed. Not dramatic revelations. Not sudden confessions. But slow, uneasy recollections from people who had once believed they had nothing important to contribute. A co-worker from years ago described a conversation that felt insignificant at the time. The suspect had asked questions about the victim's routine. Small details. What time she left work. which route she drove, whether she usually stopped anywhere on the way home. At the time, it sounded like curiosity. Now it sounded different. Another witness described a moment of discomfort, a remark made shortly after the disappearance. Something that, in hindsight, felt too specific, too informed, too early. The courtroom listened in silence. But the most impactful testimony came from the reopened investigative files. Detectives took the stand and described the early days of the case. The chaos, the volume of tips, the confusion, how easily information had blurred together in the first critical weeks, and how certain details, overlooked at the time, later gained significance. One investigator described a moment that stayed with him for years. A pattern in the suspect's behavior during early questioning. Not aggression, not panic, something more subtle. Control, measured responses, a careful avoidance of certain topics. Not enough to justify arrest at the time, but enough, in retrospect, to raise questions that never fully went away. Defense attorneys pushed back. Hard. They emphasized memory decay. They highlighted the dangers of retrospective interpretation. They reminded the jury that humans are not recordings. They forget. They reinterpret. They reconstruct meaning where none existed. And they were right. That was the central tension of the entire case. How much of the past could truly be trusted after so many years? Outside the courthouse, the town itself felt divided. Some residents believed justice was finally catching up. Others could not reconcile the accusations with the person they thought they knew. The suspect had lived among them, shopped in the same stores, attended the same community events, exchanged greetings, lived an ordinary life. That ordinariness became the most unsettling element of all, because it forced a question nobody wanted to fully answer. How well do you really know anyone? Inside the courtroom, the prosecution introduced something else. A reconstruction timeline, not of speculation, but of verified movements. Data points collected from old records, phone logs preserved in archives, work schedules, receipts, fragments of daily life that, when placed together, created a narrow window of opportunity, a window that aligned with the time of the disappearance. The defense attempted to challenge the precision of the timeline. They argued uncertainty. They pointed to gaps. They emphasized missing data. But the prosecution's strategy was not perfection. It was convergence. Multiple imperfect sources pointing toward a single possibility. As the hearing progressed, tension built in layers rather than explosions. No single moment defined the day. Instead, it was accumulation. Detail after detail. Statement after statement. Each one adding weight. By the time court recessed, exhaustion filled the room. Not just physical exhaustion, emotional fatigue, the kind that comes from confronting something unresolved for too long. Outside, reporters rushed to summarize what they had heard, but none of them had the full picture yet. That was still locked inside the case file, still protected, still unfolding. That night, investigators returned to their offices. The building was quieter than usual. Lights remained on late into the evening. Case files were spread across desks. Whiteboards filled with timelines and connections. Photos pinned in clusters that had evolved over years of revisions. A detective stood in front of one board longer than the others. The victim's photograph remained at the center, surrounded by lines, connections, questions. He had worked the case long enough to remember when it felt impossible. Now it felt close. But close is not the same as complete. There were still missing pieces. The exact sequence of events that night remained unclear. The precise interaction between victim and suspect remained unproven in detail. The motive remained inferred, not confirmed. And in criminal investigations, inference is never enough on its own. It must be supported, validated, corroborated. As the night deepened, a new focus emerged among the team. Digital reconstruction of old communication patterns. Re-examination of archived neighborhood activity. A search for anything previously dismissed as irrelevant. Because cold cases often break open not from new evidence alone, but from new ways of interpreting old evidence. Meanwhile, the suspect remained in custody. Quiet, unresponsive, legally present, but emotionally distant from the storm surrounding him. His legal team prepared aggressively for what came next. They knew the prosecution's case was strong, but strength does not guarantee certainty. And certainty is what the law requires. The next phase would determine everything, whether the case would move toward conviction, or fracture under scrutiny, or remain suspended in ambiguity even after all these years. For the victim's family, the waiting continued, but it was no longer the same kind of waiting as before. This was no longer waiting for something to happen. It was waiting for something already in motion to reach its conclusion. And somewhere beneath the formal language of court proceedings, beneath the forensic reports and legal arguments, beneath decades of investigative work, one truth remained unchanged. A young woman had left work one night in 2000 and never returned home. And now, after all these years, the world was finally forced to look directly at the question it had avoided for decades. Not just what happened, but how something like this could remain hidden for so long. The fourth day of proceedings began with rain hitting the courthouse windows in slow, relentless sheets, as if the sky itself had decided to stay and listen. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted again, subtly, but unmistakably. What had started as shock had evolved into something sharper. Scrutiny. Every statement was now weighed against everything said before. Every witness was measured not just for what they remembered, but for what they might have missed. The prosecution brought in a different kind of evidence that morning. Not dramatic, not emotional, but deeply unsettling in its simplicity. Maps, old ones first, then reconstructed ones, then overlays of digital analysis built from years of archived data. The victim's last known route was drawn across the screen. A thin line connecting work to home. Familiar roads. Familiar intersections. Places she had likely driven hundreds of times before. Then another layer appeared. The suspect's known locations from that period. Workplace. Residence. Routine travel paths. The two patterns did not initially appear connected. They were ordinary lives running in parallel. Until they weren't. The prosecution did not claim coincidence. They did not need to. They showed proximity. And proximity in homicide investigations is never neutral. The defense objected at several points, arguing that geographic overlap proves nothing on its own. And they were correct in a strict legal sense. But the jury was no longer looking at isolated data points. They were seeing a pattern forming across years of fragmented evidence. A pattern that only became visible when time itself was compressed. The next witness changed the tone of the entire room. A forensic analyst. Calm, precise, carefully choosing every word. She explained how modern DNA interpretation differs from the technology available in 2000. Back then, results were often partial, incomplete, and difficult to contextualize. Now, even degraded samples could yield meaningful profiles. She walked the courtroom through the process step by step. Extraction, amplification, comparison, verification, each stage reinforced by independent replication. No single lab, no single technician, multiple confirmations. The defense attempted to challenge the handling of the original evidence. They questioned storage conditions, temperature fluctuations, potential contamination during early processing. But the analyst remained firm. Every transfer had been documented, every seal recorded, every movement logged. The evidence had not simply survived time. It had been protected by it. Still, science alone rarely resolves human doubt. So the prosecution returned to behavior. Patterns again, but this time more personal. A former acquaintance took the stand. Someone who had known the suspect casually during the early 2000s. Not close, not intimate, but familiar enough to observe changes over time. The witness described a shift in demeanor shortly after the disappearance became public. A sudden increase in caution. A noticeable withdrawal from conversations involving the investigation. An unusual sensitivity when the topic was mentioned in passing. At first, these details seemed trivial. But investigators had learned long ago that in cold cases, the smallest behavioral inconsistencies often matter most, because people do not usually change behavior without reason. The defense countered immediately. They emphasized stress, community panic, media attention, the psychological impact of living in a town shaken by violence. They argued that anyone could have acted differently under those conditions. And that argument carried weight, because it was plausible, and plausibility is often the strongest shield against suspicion. But then came something harder to dismiss: a reconstructed timeline of communications. Old phone records pulled from archive systems. Text messages no longer fully recoverable, but partially reconstructed through carrier logs. Call durations, timestamps, patterns of activity concentrated around critical periods. A cluster of calls appeared on the night of the disappearance. Not unusual individually, but notable when aligned with known movements. The prosecution did not claim they could explain every call. They did not need to. They only needed to show relevance. The defense pushed back again. They pointed to gaps in data, missing metadata, incomplete records. They reminded the court that absence of evidence is not evidence of presence. But the cumulative weight of the case was beginning to shift perception, not legally, but emotionally. And that distinction matters more than people often admit. By midday, the courtroom had settled into a rhythm of tension and restraint. No one spoke unnecessarily. Even the smallest sounds felt amplified. Paper being turned, pens clicking, footsteps in the hallway outside. Everything felt like it might matter. Outside the courthouse, the rain continued. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, waiting for anything that could be translated into a headline. But the real developments were still happening inside, behind closed doors, in controlled language, in structured testimony. The next piece of evidence came from digital reconstruction specialists, a relatively new field compared to the original investigation. They had taken fragmented historical data and rebuilt a model of possible movements during the critical time frame. Not speculation, simulation, based on verified inputs. The result was not a single narrative, but a narrowing of possibilities, a tightening corridor of probability that pointed toward a specific window of time and space. And within that window, the suspect's presence became increasingly difficult to ignore. The defense called it overinterpretation. They warned against giving too much weight to reconstructed models. They emphasized uncertainty. But uncertainty can cut both ways. It can weaken a case, or it can highlight what remains unexplained. As the afternoon progressed, the emotional strain in the courtroom became more visible. The victim's family remained composed, but still, every detail reopened something that had never fully healed. Every timeline reassembled a night they could never revisit without pain. For them, this was not an intellectual exercise. It was memory made public. The prosecution, aware of this, carefully avoided unnecessary dramatization. They did not need it. The facts already carried enough weight. By the time court recessed for the day, no final conclusions had been reached. No verdicts. No declarations. Only accumulation. The kind that builds slowly until it becomes impossible to ignore. That evening, investigators returned again to their files. But something had changed in their approach. They were no longer searching for whether the suspect could be connected. They were searching for how strongly that connection could be proven. That shift is subtle, but important. It marks the transition from investigation to confirmation, from suspicion to structure, from possibility to prosecution strategy. One detective revisited an old interview transcript, something recorded years earlier but dismissed at the time. A small inconsistency in a timeline provided by a witness close to the suspect. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, aligned with everything else, it meant something else entirely. This is how cold cases evolve. Not through sudden revelation, but through reinterpretation. As the night deepened, a quiet realization spread among the investigative team. The case was no longer held together by a single piece of evidence. It was held together by convergence. Multiple independent strands pointing in the same direction. None perfect, none absolute, but together, increasingly difficult to dismiss. And still, despite all of it, one essential truth remained just out of reach. The final sequence of events on that October night. What actually happened after the victim left work? What occurred in those missing minutes? And why, after so many years, the answer still felt just beyond the edge of reach. Outside, the rain finally began to slow, but inside the courthouse system, the pressure only continued to build, because everyone involved understood the same thing. The next developments would not simply add information. They would determine whether this decades-old mystery would finally begin to close, or remain, even now, partially unsolved in the places that matter most. By the fifth morning, the courthouse no longer felt like a place where arguments were being made. It felt like a place where reality itself was being rebuilt, piece by piece, version by version, each side trying to control the shape of a story that had already lived for 20 years in the dark. The prosecution entered with something different that day. Not another timeline, not another witness, but a single object carried in a sealed evidence container. Small, unremarkable in appearance, yet carrying the weight of everything that had come before it. The jury leaned forward as the prosecutor carefully explained what they were about to see. This was not new evidence. It was old evidence, reinterpreted, retested, revalidated under modern forensic standards that did not exist when the case began. The container was opened. Gloves handled everything with almost ceremonial precision. Inside was biological material collected from the original crime scene, preserved through decades of storage protocols. For years, it had been nothing more than a fragment of possibility. Too degraded, too incomplete, too uncertain to stand alone. But science had changed, and now so had the case. The forensic expert took the stand again. Her voice remained steady, but there was something sharper in her tone this time. Not emotion, confidence. She explained how advanced DNA sequencing allowed for interpretation of partial profiles that would have been unusable in 2000. The courtroom listened as she described how overlapping genetic markers were isolated, filtered, and compared against a reference sample taken from the suspect under warrant. The defense immediately objected to the framing. They argued that partial profiles are inherently probabilistic. That interpretation depends on assumptions. That science, when incomplete, can mislead as easily as it can reveal. But the expert did not retreat. She clarified that this was not speculation. It was statistical certainty expressed through modern forensic standards. Then she said the number, the match probability. So small it was almost abstract, a figure that translated, in practical terms, to exclusion of coincidence. A silence spread across the room that felt heavier than any argument. The jury did not react dramatically. They simply absorbed it, slowly, carefully, as if understanding that this moment would become part of something far larger than the courtroom itself. The defense requested a recess immediately, and for the first time in days, the room emptied without resistance. Outside, the media erupted. Inside, investigators remained calm. They had already seen this moment coming, not in exact form, but in direction, because the DNA was never just about identification. It was about anchoring everything else. Behavior, timelines, witness statements, geography. All of it now had a central point of gravity. When proceedings resumed, the tone shifted again. The prosecution began to tighten the narrative, no longer presenting broad possibilities, now focusing on sequence, on reconstruction, on narrowing the night into something understandable. They described the victim leaving work, the familiar route, the expected timeline, then introduced a critical gap, a window of time that had never been fully accounted for in earlier investigations. A stretch of minutes between departure and disappearance that had always been treated as open space. Now was no longer empty. It was occupied by inference, by forensic placement, by reconstructed probability. The defense pushed back hard. They reminded the court that absence of surveillance in 2000 meant no definitive movement tracking existed. They argued that reconstruction is not reality, only interpretation. But interpretation, when repeated across multiple independent systems, begins to harden into something harder to dismiss. The prosecution then introduced something unexpected. Not physical evidence, not forensic data, but behavioral reconstruction based on digital era analysis of archived communications patterns. It was a modern method applied retroactively, a way of mapping human interaction rhythms across time. What emerged was not a confession, not a direct link, but something more subtle, a narrowing of behavioral anomaly, a cluster of activity that appeared inconsistent with normal routine patterns during the critical time frame. The defense objected again, this time more forcefully. They argued that behavioral modeling risks projecting intent where none can be proven, and they were right in principle. But juries do not live in principle. They live in accumulation. By midday, the courtroom tension had shifted from confrontation to exhaustion. Everyone was aware of the same thing. The case was no longer about whether something happened. It was about how much of it could be proven in sequence. That distinction matters more than it seems, because criminal trials are not about storytelling. They're about constraints. What can be said? What can be shown? What can be proven beyond reasonable doubt? In the afternoon, the prosecution called one of the most important witnesses yet, a digital forensics specialist who had worked on reanalyzing archived communication records. He described the process of recovering partial data from legacy systems. Not messages themselves in full, but metadata, timestamps, routing logs, fragments of communication infrastructure that had survived technological transitions. From these fragments, a pattern emerged, a cluster of contact activity that aligned with the disappearance window. Not definitive on its own, but significant when layered with everything else. The defense attempted to dismantle the interpretation. They emphasized survivorship bias in data recovery. They argued that missing information could completely alter the perceived pattern. But the specialist remained firm. He did not claim completeness. He claimed consistency. And consistency, when repeated across independent domains, begins to matter. As the day progressed, the emotional weight inside the courtroom shifted again. Not toward anger, not toward resolution, but toward inevitability. Even those skeptical of the prosecution's case could sense the direction it was moving. Not toward certainty yet, but toward convergence so tight it was becoming difficult to separate possibility from probability. Outside the courthouse, the town itself felt suspended. People watched updates in silence, not because they lacked opinions, but because those opinions no longer felt stable. Every new detail reshaped what they thought they knew. Every revelation restructured memory. By late afternoon, the court prepared for a sealed testimony segment. Certain details were withheld from public disclosure due to procedural sensitivity. Only the jury, attorneys, and judge remained inside. The doors closed. The atmosphere changed immediately. What followed was not fully recorded in public transcripts, but what emerged afterward suggested something significant had occurred. A shift in the internal confidence of the prosecution's case. Not a declaration, but a strengthening, a tightening of narrative cohesion. When the court reopened, the visible energy in the room had changed. The prosecution no longer appeared exploratory. They appeared focused. The defense, by contrast, seemed increasingly engaged in containment, not dismantling, preserving doubt. As the session approached its end, the judge announced a continuation for the following day. But something had already shifted irreversibly. The case had crossed a threshold, no longer purely investigative, no longer purely reconstructive. It was now approaching adjudication territory, where evidence is no longer just examined. It is weighed. And once that process begins, there is no return to uncertainty as it once existed. That evening, inside the investigative office, the team gathered once more. The atmosphere was quieter than before, not because progress had stopped, but because it had accelerated beyond conversation. One detective looked at the case board for a long time without speaking. The victim's image remained central. surrounded now by layers of converging data. DNA confirmation, behavioral reconstruction, witness reinterpretation, forensic reanalysis, timeline compression, none of it individually absolute, but together forming something increasingly difficult to ignore. Still, one question remained unresolved. The human question: what actually happened in the final moments? Not reconstructed, not modeled, not inferred, but real. That answer still lived somewhere beyond the reach of evidence. And until it surfaced, even the strongest case remained, in some quiet way, incomplete. Outside, the town prepared for another day of testimony. And beneath the surface of legal procedure, one truth was becoming harder to deny with each passing hour. The past was no longer buried. It was being rebuilt in real time. And everyone involved was now too far in to turn back. The sixth morning arrived without ceremony, but the atmosphere inside the courthouse had changed in a way that could not be ignored. It was no longer anticipation. It was expectation. People no longer asked what might happen next. They asked what would finally be confirmed. The prosecution entered with a smaller team that day. Fewer documents, fewer visual exhibits, but more precision. They were narrowing the case now, not expanding it. Every word mattered more than before. The first presentation was a refined reconstruction of the night in question, adjusted again using newly validated forensic timestamps and cross-reference data. The victim's departure from work was no longer treated as a single moment. It was treated as a sequence. Exit, movement through parking lot, initial travel segment, then a narrowing corridor of time where external observation ceased. That corridor had always existed, but now it had been tightened, refined, and defined with greater accuracy than at any point in the past 2 decades. The prosecution did not claim to know every detail inside that gap. They did something more strategic. They demonstrated control over everything outside it. And in forensic reconstruction, control of boundaries often matters more than the unknown itself. The defense immediately challenged the presentation. They emphasized the danger of overconfidence in reconstructed timelines. They argued that precision can create the illusion of certainty where none exists. But the jury had now heard enough variations of the same pattern that skepticism alone no longer carried the same weight it once did. The prosecution then shifted to something more personal. Not speculative behavior, not modeling, but testimony from a previously overlooked investigative interview conducted in the early stages of the original case. A transcript was introduced. Old, nearly forgotten, but preserved in archived files. A conversation between investigators and an individual who had interacted indirectly with both the victim and the suspect in the weeks before the disappearance. At the time, it had been cataloged as low relevance, one of hundreds. Now, in the context of everything else, it carried new implications. The witness described a moment that stood out in memory. A brief encounter, a passing comment from the suspect that, in isolation, seemed harmless, but contained specificity that now raised concern. The kind of detail that, according to investigators, aligned too closely with restricted knowledge about the victim's routine. The defense objected to interpretation. They stressed the unreliability of memory after such a long period. They emphasized how narratives evolve when people are repeatedly questioned about traumatic events. And they were right to do so, because memory is not static. It shifts. It adapts. It fills gaps unconsciously. But the prosecution was no longer relying on memory alone. They were layering it. Memory supported by forensic data, supported by timeline reconstruction, supported by behavioral analysis, supported by genetic evidence already presented. Individually, each strand could be questioned. Together, they began forming a structure that was harder to destabilize. The next witness was a financial records analyst, a quieter segment of the case, but one that added unexpected depth. She presented reconstructed financial activity patterns from archived banking data. Not dramatic, not incriminating on its own, but revealing in rhythm. Regular patterns of behavior interrupted during the critical period of the investigation. a brief anomaly in normal transactional flow, a disruption in routine activity that aligned with the time frame of the disappearance. The defense argued that financial irregularities are common and often meaningless without context. But context at this stage was no longer isolated. It had been assembled piece by piece across multiple domains. The prosecution did not need any single element to be definitive. They needed convergence, and convergence was beginning to tighten. As the morning progressed, the courtroom atmosphere shifted again. Subtle, but noticeable. Jurors were no longer simply observing. They were tracking relationships between pieces of information. They were mapping connections mentally as each new layer was introduced. The prosecution understood this dynamic, so they adjusted their pacing. Slower delivery, clearer transitions, fewer distractions. Each piece of evidence was allowed to settle before the next was introduced. By midday, the defense requested another brief recess. The request was granted. Outside, reporters attempted to interpret what they had just witnessed. But the real significance remained internal to the courtroom. Inside, investigators and attorneys were now operating in a different phase of the case. Not discovery, not presentation, but consolidation. When proceedings resumed, the prosecution introduced a critical visual timeline overlay. This time, it was not just movement data. It included environmental conditions, traffic patterns from reconstructed municipal records, weather data from archived meteorological sources, even lighting conditions based on seasonal sunset timing. The goal was not just to show where people could have been, but what conditions existed around their possible movements. The victim's final known window was placed into this environmental framework, and suddenly the abstract became physical. Darkness, road visibility, traffic scarcity, all contributing to a narrowing of realistic scenarios. The defense objected again, arguing that environmental reconstruction introduces interpretive bias. But the cumulative effect of the evidence was no longer easily contained within individual objections. The prosecution then introduced something unexpected again. Not evidence of action, but absence of contradiction. They presented a compiled summary of all major witness statements collected over 2 decades. Hundreds of interviews, re-examined and categorized. What stood out was not consistency in detail, but consistency in direction. None of the statements directly contradicted the prosecution's emerging theory in a way that could dismantle it entirely. There were inconsistencies. Yes, memory conflicts, timing variations, interpretive differences, but no single account that could fully reverse the trajectory of the case. That absence became its own kind of evidence. Not proof, but reinforcement. By late afternoon, the courtroom had entered a state of controlled tension. Not dramatic, not chaotic, controlled. Each side understood the stakes had risen significantly. The defense was now focused on maintaining reasonable doubt at all costs. The prosecution was focused on preventing fragmentation of the narrative they had built. As the day neared its end, one final witness was called. A senior investigator who had worked on the case during its early years and later returned during the cold case review phase. His testimony was different from the others, less technical, more reflective. He described the emotional weight of reopening a case that had remained unresolved for so long. But he also described something more critical, the moment when old assumptions began to collapse under new analysis. He spoke carefully about how initial investigative directions in 2000 had been influenced by limited forensic capability and overwhelming information noise. He admitted that certain early interpretations, while reasonable at the time, may have narrowed focus too quickly. That admission mattered because it reframed the entire case history, not as failure, but as limitation. And limitation, once acknowledged, creates space for reinterpretation. The defense attempted to challenge this framing, but the tone of the courtroom had already shifted. It was no longer about defending early uncertainty. It was about evaluating current convergence. As proceedings concluded for the day, The judge reminded both sides that the next phase would move toward final evidentiary consolidation. The words were procedural, but the implication was clear. The case was approaching its decisive stage. That evening, the investigative team worked later than usual. The office was quieter now, less fragmented, more focused. Evidence boards had been refined repeatedly. Redundant theories removed. Only the strongest connections remained visible. One detective stood in front of the central board for a long time. He was not looking for new information. He was looking for what still did not fit. Because even in cases nearing resolution, investigators know to distrust completeness. There is always something missing. A detail not yet recovered. A moment not fully explained. And in this case, that missing element remained the final sequence of events. The human truth behind the data. The part no reconstruction had fully captured. Outside, the town continued to wait. Not for more information, but for finality. And as the case moved closer to its resolution phase, one reality became increasingly unavoidable. The story was no longer expanding. It was closing in on itself. By the seventh day, the courtroom felt less like a place of debate and more like a place of narrowing corridors, where every argument funneled toward a single point that no one could yet fully see, but everyone could already feel approaching. The prosecution arrived knowing this was no longer about building the case. It was about sealing it. They began with a methodical review of everything already presented, but compressed into a tighter structure, almost like stripping away everything unnecessary until only the skeleton of the narrative remained. The victim leaves work. She enters a known travel window. Within that window, forensic probability places the suspect in overlapping proximity. DNA evidence anchors physical presence. Behavioral and communication patterns reinforce opportunity. Witness recollections, though imperfect, align directionally rather than contradict. Each category alone remained open to interpretation. Together, they began to form a closed system. The defense immediately pushed back on that framing. They argued that closed system thinking in criminal cases is dangerous because it can turn correlation into perceived causation. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof is not alignment. It is certainty beyond reasonable doubt. And certainty, they insisted, had not yet been achieved. But the tone of their argument had subtly changed compared to earlier days. Less aggressive, more defensive, as if they were no longer trying to dismantle the structure entirely, but prevent it from tightening further. The prosecution then introduced a new angle. Not new evidence, but recontextualization of existing forensic results through updated statistical modeling. They brought in a specialist who explained how probabilistic interpretation in DNA matching has evolved significantly since the early 2000s. Back then, results were often reported in simpler terms. Match or no match. But modern interpretation introduces weighted likelihood ratios that account for degradation, partial profiles, and environmental contamination risks in a more structured way. What emerged from this reanalysis was not ambiguity, but reinforcement. The likelihood of the suspect's genetic material appearing at the crime scene under innocent circumstances was described in extremely narrow statistical terms. Not impossible, but approaching the outer limits of plausibility. The defense attempted to challenge the assumptions behind those models. They focused on input sensitivity, on how small changes in assumptions can alter outputs. And again, they were correct in principle. But principle alone was no longer the battlefield. The courtroom had moved into accumulation territory. Then came something unexpected. A supplemental testimony from a forensic technician involved in evidence preservation during the original investigation. Not an analyst, not a lead investigator, but someone responsible for handling physical evidence storage. Their testimony was brief, but impactful in a subtle way. They confirmed the strict chain of custody protocols maintained over 2 decades. They described the storage conditions, controlled access, logged entry, restricted handling. The importance of this testimony was not dramatic revelation. It was elimination of alternative explanations. Contamination arguments lose strength when procedural integrity is consistently documented across time. The defense recognized this immediately and shifted strategy. They began focusing more heavily on timeline uncertainty. If physical evidence was becoming harder to dispute, then temporal interpretation became their remaining leverage point. They returned to the gap, the missing minutes, the unobserved corridor of time between departure and disappearance. They argued that no reconstruction, regardless of sophistication, can fully restore unknown movement. And that remains true. But the prosecution was prepared for that argument. They introduced something more subtle, a constraint-based reconstruction model. Instead of attempting to define exactly what happened, they defined what could not reasonably have happened based on all known constraints. Road conditions, traffic absence, environmental visibility, known travel speeds, physical distance limitations. The result was not a single narrative. It was a narrowing of possibilities, a reduction of plausible scenarios to a limited set of outcomes, all of which included interaction with another individual during that window. And within that narrowed set, the suspect remained consistently present as a viable participant. The defense objected again, arguing that reducing possibilities does not equate to identifying a perpetrator. But the courtroom had begun to shift in perception, not legally, but cognitively. Jurors were no longer hearing isolated claims. They were tracking constraint stacking. Each new layer removed uncertainty from one direction while tightening it in another. By midday, the emotional weight of proceedings became more visible in subtle ways. The victim's family remained composed, but their stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of endurance. It was the stillness of proximity to resolution. The prosecution then called a critical witness, a retired detective who had originally worked the case in 2000. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere, because he represented something no modern analysis could replicate: first-hand memory of the original investigative environment. He described the early chaos of the case, the flood of tips, the pressure for media attention, the limitations of forensic technology at the time. But more importantly, he described investigative decisions that, in hindsight, he now viewed differently. He spoke carefully about how initial focus had been shaped by what was known at the time, and how certain assumptions may have unintentionally narrowed the investigative field too early. He did not express regret, but reflection. And reflection in a courtroom carries its own weight. The defense attempted to use this testimony to argue investigative bias. That early direction may have influenced later interpretation, but the prosecution reframed it differently. They argued it demonstrated continuity of effort, a case not abandoned, but revisited with improved tools and perspective. The courtroom absorbed both interpretations simultaneously, neither fully winning, neither fully losing. Then, as the afternoon session continued, the prosecution returned to behavioral reconstruction once more, but this time with a narrower focus. Not general patterns, specific time-bound behavior surrounding the disappearance window. They introduced aggregated movement data reconstructed from multiple indirect sources. The result was not a precise map of actions, but a tightening cluster of probability around key temporal markers. What stood out was not what was proven, but what remained consistently aligned across all models. The suspect's plausibility within the critical time frame did not disappear under scrutiny. It persisted. The defense grew increasingly focused on preserving doubt at the edges, highlighting uncertainty in each data set, pointing out where gaps still existed. And gaps still did exist. That was undeniable. No reconstruction of an old case can achieve perfect completeness. But the prosecution's strategy had never been perfection. It had been convergence under constraint. By the time court recessed, the dynamic in the room had shifted again. Not toward conclusion, but toward compression. Everything was tightening. Arguments, timelines, interpretations, even uncertainty itself was becoming structured. That evening, inside the investigative office, the atmosphere felt different. Less urgency, more focus, like a system approaching final calibration. The central case board had been refined further, redundant theories removed. Only the strongest evidentiary links remained visible. One detective traced a line connecting forensic confirmation to timeline constraint to behavioral anomaly. It formed a chain, not perfect, but increasingly resistant to disruption. Yet even now, one question remained unresolved in every mind in the room. Not whether evidence was strong enough, but whether the missing human sequence, the exact lived reality of that October night, would ever be fully reconstructed. Because even when legal certainty is achieved, narrative completeness often remains just out of reach. And somewhere in that gap between law and lived reality, the final answer still lingered, waiting for a form it may never fully take. On the 8th morning, the courthouse no longer carried the energy of a trial unfolding. It carried the weight of a verdict being assembled in real time. There was a difference now in how people moved through the space. Slower, more deliberate, as if even walking too quickly might disturb something fragile taking shape inside the room. The prosecution entered with a noticeably refined strategy. They were no longer presenting broad categories of evidence. They were assembling a final chain, a linear structure meant to replace interpretation with inevitability. They began with what they called the core convergence model, a simplified reconstruction that removed everything non-essential. No speculation, no alternative branching scenarios, only the strongest, most consistent elements from every previous day. The victim's departure, the verified travel window, the forensic DNA confirmation, the geographic overlap, the behavioral pattern alignment, the constraint-based timeline narrowing. Each piece was placed in sequence, not as independent arguments, but as dependent links, one leading into the next. The effect was subtle but powerful, because the human mind processes sequence differently from fragments. Sequence feels like direction. Direction feels like intent. The defense recognized the shift immediately. They objected to the framing, arguing that the prosecution was presenting an edited narrative rather than the full evidentiary landscape. But the prosecution responded with something equally deliberate. They said they were not removing uncertainty. They were isolating certainty within uncertainty. And that distinction became the central tension of the day. The first major witness of the morning was a forensic reconstruction specialist who had worked across multiple cold case units nationwide. Their testimony focused on how modern investigative methodology treats incomplete historical crime scenes. They explained that older cases are rarely solved by discovering entirely new evidence. Instead, resolution often comes from reweighting existing evidence under improved scientific frameworks. The courtroom listened as they described how small fragments of data, once considered insignificant, gained disproportionate relevance when placed inside constrained models. The defense pushed back again, emphasizing that increased relevance is not the same as proof. But the specialist's final statement lingered in the room longer than intended. They said that while individual uncertainties remain, systems of converging evidence can reach levels of practical exclusion for alternative explanations. Not philosophical certainty, but operational certainty, a phrase that subtly shifted the atmosphere again. After a brief recess, the prosecution introduced the most tightly focused segment of the entire trial so far. A minute-by-minute reconstruction of the critical window, not hypothetical movement, not generalized travel patterns, but constrained intervals derived from all available data sources combined. They began by defining the last confirmed point of independence for the victim. Then they outlined the maximum plausible travel time under optimal conditions. Then they overlaid environmental conditions that evening: visibility, traffic density, and seasonal timing. Each layer reduced variability. Each layer narrowed possibility. The defense objected multiple times, arguing that compounding constraints can artificially tighten uncertainty ranges beyond what real-world unpredictability allows. But the prosecution countered with one consistent argument. Every constraint they used was independently verified. None were assumptions. All were measured or reconstructed from historical data. As the model tightened, something became increasingly apparent in the courtroom. Not a conclusion, but a reduction. The space in which alternative narratives could exist was shrinking. Then came a pivotal moment. The prosecution introduced a synthesized evidentiary timeline overlay, a visual reconstruction showing all major categories of evidence aligned against the same temporal axis. DNA placement, witness timing, behavioral anomalies, communication patterns, environmental conditions, geographic feasibility. It was not presented as a story. It was presented as a structure. And that structure showed something simple but increasingly difficult to dismiss. Every independent line of evidence converged on the same narrow window, not perfectly aligned in every detail, but consistently overlapping in direction. The defense stood immediately and objected to the implication of convergence equaling causation. The judge acknowledged the objection, but allowed the exhibit to remain under cautionary instruction, because the law permits ambiguity, but does not ignore pattern strength. As the exhibit remained on screen, the courtroom sat in a rare silence. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the visual representation had temporarily outpaced argument. When words fail to compete with structure, silence fills the gap. The next witness was not introduced for new information, but for synthesis. A lead investigator from the cold case unit who had overseen the entire modern reanalysis phase. Their testimony focused on methodology, how the case was reopened, why certain evidence was prioritized, how multiple independent laboratories were used to validate findings, and most importantly, how the investigative team ensured that no single source of data controlled the outcome. Cross-validation was the key theme. Independent replication across forensic, behavioral, and temporal datasets. The defense attempted to frame this as coordinated interpretation bias, but the investigator responded carefully. They stated that the purpose of independent systems is precisely to eliminate single-source bias, and that when independent systems converge, the result is not interpretation. It is reinforcement. By mid-afternoon, the tone in the courtroom had shifted again. There was less confrontation now, more absorption. Even the defense appeared to be transitioning strategy from dismantling the entire case to isolating remaining vulnerabilities. Because at this stage, total collapse was no longer realistic. Only partial erosion remained possible. The prosecution then returned to something deceptively simple. A map, but not a static one. A layered spatial temporal model showing overlapping movement feasibility zones for both the victim and suspect during the critical time frame. What made it powerful was not its complexity, but its restriction. Large portions of theoretical possibility space had been eliminated. What remained was a narrowing corridor of overlap. The defense highlighted that overlap does not equal interaction, and that remained true. But overlap within constrained time and environmental conditions is often the threshold where investigation becomes actionable. As the day drew toward its end, the judge allowed final statements from both sides to frame the next phase. The prosecution spoke briefly. They emphasized convergence. They emphasized consistency across independent systems. They emphasized the narrowing of plausible alternatives. The defense spoke briefly as well. They emphasized uncertainty. They emphasized the danger of retrospective reconstruction. They emphasized the necessity of absolute proof. Both arguments were valid within their own frameworks. But the courtroom was no longer operating purely in frameworks. It was operating in accumulated reality. After adjournment, the investigative team remained in the building longer than usual. The mood was quieter than earlier days, but more focused. One detective reviewed the central timeline again. There was still a missing element. Not evidence of presence, not forensic alignment, but the lived sequence of events that turned convergence into certainty. The exact interaction. The moment of transition from possibility to outcome. That gap remained unfilled. And yet, paradoxically, the absence of that final detail no longer destabilized the case in the way it once had, because the structure surrounding it had grown strong enough to stand without it. Outside, the courthouse lights reflected off the damp pavement. The city moved on, but inside the legal system, something irreversible had already begun. The case was no longer expanding into uncertainty. It was compressing toward resolution, and everyone involved could feel it, even those still arguing against it. On the 9th day, the courthouse felt different in a way that was no longer subtle. It felt finished in advance, not concluded, not decided, but shaped so tightly that every new argument had to fit inside something already forming its final outline. The prosecution entered without additional exhibits at first. No visuals, no charts, no new forensic samples, just presence and control. They began by revisiting the entire structure of the case in a compressed narrative sequence. But this time something had changed in how it was delivered. It was no longer exploratory. It was declarative in structure, even if carefully framed in legal caution. The victim's last confirmed independent moment. The constrained travel window. The forensic DNA confirmation establishing physical linkage. The environmental reconstruction limiting plausible variation. The behavioral and communication patterns reinforcing opportunity and proximity. Each element was no longer introduced as separate categories. They were spoken as a continuous chain. Linked, dependent, sequential. The defense immediately objected to what they called narrative compression, arguing that compressing evidence into a linear chain risks erasing the complexity and uncertainty inherent in each individual component. But the prosecution did not expand outward. They tightened inward. And that was the shift everyone in the room could feel. The trial was no longer expanding toward possibilities. It was contracting toward inevitability. The first witness of the day was unexpected, a data integration specialist who had not testified earlier in the trial. Their role was to explain how multiple independent forensic datasets had been merged for cross-analysis, not to interpret meaning, but to ensure structural consistency between systems. They describe how DNA probability models, geographic constraint mapping, temporal reconstruction, and behavioral pattern analysis were all processed independently before being compared in aggregate form. The key point was independence. Each system was designed to function without influence from the others. Only after completion were results layered together. The defense immediately challenged this architecture, arguing that independence of input does not guarantee independence of interpretation. But the specialist's response was precise. Interpretation was not merged. Only outcomes were. And those outcomes converged. The courtroom absorbed that distinction in silence. After a brief recess, the prosecution introduced a refined evidentiary summary that focused entirely on the elimination of alternative explanations. This was not framed as proving guilt directly. It was framed as systematically removing viable innocent scenarios within the established constraints. They revisited the timeline first. The victim's departure, the maximum plausible travel time, the environmental conditions restricting visibility and movement. Then they layered in the absence of any credible third-party interaction evidence within that window. Not absence of possibility, absence of support. The defense stood immediately. They emphasized that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that principle remained legally correct. But the prosecution responded with a subtle but important shift. They were no longer arguing absence. They were arguing narrowing, and narrowing, repeated across multiple independent domains, begins to function as structural pressure. The next witness was a behavioral analysis expert who had reviewed long-term communication and activity patterns reconstructed from archived data. Their testimony was careful, avoiding psychological diagnosis, focusing instead on observable behavioral deviations from established baseline patterns. They describe how, in the days surrounding the disappearance, certain activity markers deviated from long-term norms in ways that aligned temporally with a critical window. Not extreme deviations, subtle ones, but consistent across multiple datasets. The defense challenged the interpretation, arguing that retrospective behavioral modeling is inherently vulnerable to confirmation bias. But the expert did not claim intent. They claimed alignment, and alignment was becoming the central theme of the entire case. By midday, something had changed in the courtroom dynamic. Even objections were becoming more procedural than adversarial. The energy of confrontation was fading, replaced by something closer to containment. Both sides understood that the structure of the case had already shifted. What remained was refinement. The prosecution then introduced what they called the final constraint matrix, a synthesized model combining all validated constraints from every category of evidence: geographic limits, temporal limits, environmental limits, forensic limits, behavioral limits, communication limits, each one individually imperfect, but together forming a highly restricted feasibility space. The presentation was careful not to overstate conclusions, but the visual impact was undeniable. The overlap region was small, consistently small across multiple independent modeling approaches. The defense objected to the implication that reduced possibility space equates to identification. And again, legally, they were correct. But the courtroom was now operating in a different cognitive mode. Not isolated analysis, but cumulative perception. After another recess, the prosecution called a senior forensic coordinator who had overseen quality control for evidence reanalysis. Their testimony focused on validation integrity, how every forensic result had been independently verified, how labs were cross-audited, how error margins were recalculated under modern standards, and how no single dataset had been allowed to define conclusions independently. The defense attempted to challenge potential systemic bias introduced through coordinated reinterpretation. But the coordinator responded with a critical distinction. Coordination was applied to verification, not origin. Each dataset originated independently. Only after validation were they compared. That distinction mattered because it preserved structural integrity across the entire investigative framework. As the afternoon progressed, the courtroom entered a quieter state. Not anticipation, not suspense, but absorption. Even jurors appeared less reactive and more analytical, tracking relationships between arguments rather than individual claims. The prosecution then returned briefly to something already introduced but now reframed: the DNA evidence, but not as standalone confirmation, as a central anchor within a multi-system convergence model. They emphasized that DNA alone would not have been sufficient decades ago under older forensic standards, but combined with modern constraint modeling, behavioral analysis, and temporal reconstruction, its role shifted. It became a stabilizing element in a broader system rather than a singular proof point. The defense attempted one final sustained challenge to forensic interpretation, focusing on the risk of overconfidence in modern probabilistic frameworks. But their argument now functioned more as caution than disruption, because the prosecution's case no longer depended on a single point of failure. It depended on structural cohesion. By the time the judge adjourned proceedings for the day, the tone had shifted into something almost final. Not verdict, but closure trajectory. Outside the courthouse, the world continued without interruption. Cars passed. People moved through ordinary routines. Nothing visible reflected the intensity of what had occurred inside. But inside the investigative team's workspace later that evening, there was no longer debate about direction. The central question had changed. It was no longer whether the suspect could be connected to the crime. It was how far the convergence could be pushed before the law itself would declare it sufficient. And still, beneath everything that had been assembled, one unresolved fragment remained. The lived sequence of that night. The exact human moment where all constraints collapsed into action. That moment still existed beyond reconstruction. And in that gap, even a near-complete case still carried its last shadow of uncertainty. But for the first time in 20 years, that shadow no longer defined the case. It only remained inside it. By the 10th day, the trial no longer felt like it was uncovering the past. It felt like it was deciding how the past would be officially remembered. The courthouse opened earlier than usual, but the corridors were already full. Not with chaos, with stillness, a restrained, heavy silence that followed people into every room like a second presence. The prosecution entered knowing they were approaching the final structural phase of their case. No more expansion, only consolidation.